Okay, thank you. What I want to do first of all is to look at some broad contextual issues before I start to look at specific policy challenges for the United Kingdom, because I think these contextual issues set the scene within which policy choices can be made. There are 8 of them in total. First of these is globalisation. The recession has slowed this process of globalisation. In particular, we're not seeing trade liberalisation proceeding at the speed that it was doing. Indeed, the Doha round is effectively ground to a halt. However, that doesn't mean that globalisation is likely to go into reverse. And of course, in particular, the existence of a global financial system is an established fact. Now, that existence of that global financial system really brings me to my second point, which is despite some changes, the global financial system has not really been subject to effective regulation, either at a domestic level, but even more important, at the global level, where it is most required. Admittedly, there have been measures announced this week by the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, but those will not come into force until 2019. So what we've had in Polanyi's terms is a commodification of money. Given the size and the character of what is called the shadow financial system, this means problems are likely to be encountered again in the future. In particular, I think the too big to fail problem has not been solved, despite what the government of Bank of England was saying yesterday. The third contextual factor relates to ageing populations. These present a big challenge for many societies, and there really has been a failure to engage in much in the way of joined-up thinking on these issues. But it's a particular challenge for countries in Europe, because countries in Europe account for around 20% of world GDP, but for around 50% of welfare expenditure, and of course welfare expenditure on health and pensions tends to increase as the population ages. Fourthly, I want to say something about the European Union. Now, the European Union, I think, has always been as much a political project as it's been an economic project. It's been an effort to try and create a new type of polity, an unfamiliar type of polity, which will be better able to cope with some contemporary challenges than can be done either by nation states or by international organisations, and in particular, the need for effective regulation. The European Union is essentially a regulatory state. However, what has happened, of course, is that the European Union has become increasingly focused on the problems of the Eurozone to the exclusion of other pressing issues. And I was quite interested in Germany a couple of weeks ago. And in fact, there is an ongoing debate in Germany about whether it's not just confined to people in populist movements, but among serious academics and other policymakers, about whether the euro, in fact, should be dismantled. In any event, the European Union has lost the confidence of many of its citizens, although that was always a risk given its technocratic construction. The fifth contextual issue is divergence between the North and the South. It remains a continuing challenge. It's exemplified by the recent Ebola outbreak in West Africa. Events like Ebola can have serious economic consequences for already poor societies. It also has to be noted that emerging countries have not proved to be the drivers of the world economy in the way it was hoped for. The Chinese economy is slowing, India has many problems, and Brazil is beset by deficiencies of infrastructure. Turkey, Brazil, India, South Africa and Indonesia are often now referred to as the Fragile Five. Sixthly, climate change remains a concern for future economic performance as well as, of course, for the environment and for sustainability. However, as Wolfgang Straight has observed, environmental deterioration proceeds only slowly compared to the human lifespan. So one can deny it while learning to live with it. It's difficult to get effective coordinated international action of the kind that's required to tackle problems of climate change. Colin Crouch, seventh point, who used to be here at Warwick, has said that capitalism demands confident consumers and insecure workers. There is, of course, a an inherent contradiction there, because insecure workers will be reluctant to consume to the extent that is needed. Now, the Fordist welfare state, the system of mass production and mass welfare, which existed in Europe from the late 1940s until the 1970s, did provide secure work and effectively full employment as well as high rates of growth. But because it existed in a world in which Europe was not challenged by newly industrialising countries. Moreover, Europe operated behind protectionist walls, which have now largely gone, apart from those that exist in agriculture. The ending of the multi-fibre arrangement at the beginning of the 1990s, which limited textile and clothing exports from developing countries to Europe and elsewhere in the world, really brought to an end the role of southern European countries within the European Union, which had been as one of being low-cost suppliers to the rest of Europe, and of course is one of the causes of their present plight. And then one further contextual factor that I'd like to look at, I think what is noticeable about the present crisis, the present global financial crisis, or whatever you want to call it, is that it has not produced a new paradigm, a new way of thinking, in the sense that the crisis of the 1930s paved the way for the adoption of Keynesian policies, neo-Keynesian policies, and that of the 1970s, in effect, ushered in an era of neoliberalism. That hasn't happened in this present crisis. We haven't got some new paradigm, some new overarching way of thinking. Now, before I go on to look at contemporary British problems, one of the things I do want to do is just offer a word of warning on the attractions of the so-called German model. Germany is in many ways a very successful economy, although it's possible to exaggerate that success. Its average growth rate over the last 20 years has just been 1.3%, which is hardly spectacular. And it has its weaknesses relative to the United Kingdom, notably in software development. A future challenge for Germany is that it does not really have the sophisticated software to control driverless cars. That's in the hands of American companies like Google. It's also important to note that the German model was not a grand design. It grew incrementally, and parts of it cannot be readily transferred elsewhere. Now, if I was to select one challenge facing the contemporary British economy, it would be that of productivity. This has been a recurrent problem in the United Kingdom for a very long time. Output per hour worked is 30% greater in the United States than the United Kingdom, and it's also 29% higher in Germany, and it's even 28% higher in France, which in many respects has a deficient economy. At the end of 2013, private sector output per worker remained about 18 percentage points below the level that would have resulted from the pre-crisis trends continuing. If we'd gone on in the way that we were going before the onset of the global financial crisis, then output per worker would have been 18% higher. The scale of the productivity fall has probably been the defining feature of this particular recession and stands in contrast to previous UK recessions. Some other European countries have also experienced the productivity slowdown since 2010, but the UK has seen one of the largest falls relative to the pre-crisis trend. The US experience has been very different. The United States productivity showed a small initial drop, but quickly returned to its pre-recession trend. Now, at times in the past, it had looked as if this problem of productivity, which has beset the UK for a very long time, had gone away. The Thatcher government made progress, although in part it was a batting average of it. What this means is that if you have an economy with a number of poorly performing firms, of which there were many in Britain, I remember in the 1970s going around the West Midlands interviewing manufacturing firms, and I wondered how those firms were going to survive given their management and their production structures, because the answer is they didn't survive. But because if you knock out poorly performing firms, if these firms are forced out of business, then of itself this will bring about a rise in overall levels of productivity. Just as if in cricket you got rid of the tail order batsman in calculating averages. The long boom, the boom that existed throughout the 1990s and into the first 8 years of 2000, that produced a misplaced confidence that the economy had achieved sustained growth and was overcoming its structural problems as manifested by poor record productivity. So with the recession, this problem was returned with a vengeance. Between 2011 and 2012 quarter 3, total factor productivity fell by 3.4%. The August 2014 edition of the authoritative National Institute review states, the productivity performance remains abysmal, with output per hour worked still around 4.5% below the pre-crisis peak. We expect pre-crisis productivity levels to regain only in the latter half of 2017. Now, the National Institute refers to the continuing puzzle about the sources of poor productivity performance. Many explanations have been advanced, and there is some controversy about their relative merits, and I'm not really qualified to adjudicate between them, given that economists themselves cannot agree about their relative importance. All of the explanations probably have some merit. Now, what has happened? Well, there does seem to be the case that some firms have engaged in labour hoarding and underutilisation of labour. And I think that given the skill shortages in the economy, this has persisted much longer and has been much more extensive than many commentators have allowed. Firms want to retain skilled labour that can't be easily replaced, so they're happy to have that skilled labour underutilised. Declines in real wages have allowed firms to hang on to less productive workers. Indeed, the rise in employment has probably led to less productive workers joining the labour force and hence depress the overall productivity rates. When labour is cheap and readily available, there is not much incentive to invest in capital to improve the capital-labour ratio. In uncertain economic times, it's less risky to hire people to increase output than to make big expensive investments in machinery and other forms of capital. People on 0 hours or temporary contracts can easily be fired, but new kit has to be paid for over a number of years. It's also the case, I think, risk aversion by the banks has kept many zombie firms in existence in a way that did not happen, for example, in the recession of the early 1980s, and reduced the number of high productivity entrants because firms have found it difficult to get capital. One of the functions of a crisis in a capitalist system is to get rid of poor performers and hence improve overall performance, and that has not generally happened in the current crisis. One of the consequences of poor productivity is that it makes it more difficult for firms to raise wages, and that in turn depresses consumer demand. It also has implications for inequality, and it's inequality I want to turn to next. All the OECD countries, all the advanced industrial countries, have seen an increase in the Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, since the mid-1980s. But that increase has been more marked in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. The rise in inequality in the UK was particularly marked in the 1980s, but it grew more slowly in the 1990s and in the first decade of the current century. UK levels of inequality are much higher than those in continental Europe and in Japan. Some of the increase in inequality was due to worldwide pressures of technological change and international trade, which have affected the demand for skilled workers. But policies such as the weakening of the unions and the lowering of welfare benefits also played a role. It should also be noted that the United Kingdom has a long-standing problem of poor adult basic skills, and in particular shortcomings in literacy and numeracy in the population. Many reports estimate that around a fifth of the adult population lack such basic skills. But it's also the case that intermediate skills, that is to say skills between the basic ones and graduate level skills, are particularly poorly developed in the United Kingdom. And it's also the case that there's a relatively high proportion of young people not in education, employment or training, so-called needs. Apprenticeships are one way to tackle the problem of intermediate skills, and there has been a significant expansion in their numbers since 2010. But many of these have been for the over 25s in relatively low-skilled, low-paying jobs. Apprenticeships need to be longer, and they need to be of much higher quality. There also needs to be an element of compulsory basic skills in English and maths, which would help to tackle the problem of poor basic adult skills. The UK also has serious problems relating to deficient infrastructure, particularly in energy and transport, although insufficient housing stock is also a big problem. The 2012 World Economic Forum report on global competitiveness ranked the United Kingdom only 24th in terms of quality of overall infrastructure. A 2011 infrastructure survey by the CBI saw nearly half the respondents rate the UK's transport networks as well below average by international standards. Underinvestment and inadequate maintenance characterise the provision of roads, railways and airports. The 2006 Eddington Review, a report that was a very systematic study but was left to gather dust on the shelf, forecast a potential cost of £22 billion per year in increased congestion by 2025 if nothing was done, if the transport network was not brought up to international standards and to keep up with demand. The difficulty in coming to a decision about additional airport capacity in the southeast of England, the last couple of days we've heard that the cost of the various solutions is going to be even higher than was anticipated before, has endangered London's position as a major international airport hub. This is an area in which political problems are particularly apparent. There has been policy instability, a lack of clarity about strategy, long delays in making decisions, and frequent reversals of policy. Decisions are particularly subject to lobbying, both by the potential beneficiaries of contracts and also by chronic NIMBYism, not in your backyard, which is a strong force in the United Kingdom, also affects housing policy. All this emphasises the need for a state that is smart, a smart state, in the way that it regulates and spends. This in turn, I think, raises the debate, which has been started by the Scottish referendum, about greater decentralisation of government structures in the UK. There is much to be said for giving city regions greater powers and funding to make decisions about infrastructure, supporting skill formation and fostering innovation. However, there is a need for some caution. There are some question marks about the calibre of the local decision makers who would make these decisions, although greater powers might attract people from outside the political class with a much wider range of experience and skills. That indeed was one of the arguments for having elected mayors, which of course essentially failed, but is now being revived. It failed in the referendums, but is now being put forward again, particularly in relation to Manchester, Greater Manchester, where there's been a very effective cooperation between local authorities. There are also tensions within potential regions. They've been very evident in the West Midlands. It's heartening development in the last week that in fact Birmingham and the Black Country have chosen to overcome their traditional rivalries and combine together, to work together as local authorities. Whether in fact Coventry and Solihull will join them remains to be seen. So there are some interesting possibilities, I think, but there are also some very...
Okay, thanks for coming. So my name is Steve Kettell. It's not Kettell. Sorry, it's only because of my name. It's Kettell all the time, so I'm used to it, it's fine. So I'm Steve Kettell, and this... I wasn't quite sure what the remit for this, to be honest. It was something like in the email, it's about British politics and some stuff in there about policies and suggestions for how to do things, and because it's a think tank event, right? So I was at a choir competition last night. Don't normally go to choir competitions at midnight. It's not my thing, but my son, who's 7, was in this competition. There was all the primary schools in Coventry, they all had these choir. Why he's in the choir, it's just odd. But he's in the choir, and they had this competition. It was the final for the whole of Coventry Warwickshire. It's like a big thing for all the kids. And so I was there last night, and this was when I got the email that reminded me about this event. I hadn't done this paper, so I thought I should probably start writing it. And I was watching these kids singing at the choir, and they were rubbish, to be honest with you, because they're kids, right? They can't sing, and they're only 7 and they're going out of tune. There's only so much of it you can take. And so I was kind of watching this, and I thought, I'm just zoned out and started thinking, what should I put in this paper? And my thought process went, well, Wyn's probably going to, I'm probably going to be late because I was lecturing before this, so Wyn's probably going to be going first, and Wyn will probably do a better job than me, which he will, and so he will have forgotten more about British politics than I'm ever going to know, and so what am I going to speak about? I could come in and do the kind of, what the challenges that Britain faces, so these would be obvious things like ISIS, the challenges of radical extremism and terrorism and these kinds of things, or the challenges of globalisation, and because the global market hasn't kind of settled down, the underlying conditions that led to the crisis of 2008 are still there, they haven't been structurally addressed, so I could talk about those particular things. Britain's relationship with the European Union and how that's likely to change. The Conservatives obviously want to take us out. And how it's an interesting question as well, because the Conservatives quite like the idea, as the Labour Majors too, of course, of being close to the Americans, right? So we have this idea of the special relationship. But of course the special relationship only works, and it's only historically worked to the extent that Britain is strong with Europe, right? So the Americans are not interested in Britain if Britain is outside of Europe. So immediately, as soon as you come out of the EU, you lose the EU influence, you also lose the influence, whatever influence there might be, with the Americans too, right? So it's a kind of lose-lose situation. So I could have talked about all of that. And then I thought, well, I also could talk about some of the domestic problems that we face. Like social inequality is increasing year on year. We've got, as well, documented food banks in the country, which is just, it's the 4th largest or 5th largest, depends how you measure the economy in the world. To have food banks is sort of a morally repugnant disgrace, really. Or this idea that there's a growing political disconnect, loss of trust from politicians, we hear about this in the news all the time. Or I could have talked about the political system, the way in which the party system is changing, the kind of inexorable rise of UKIP and Nigel Farage with his perpetual half pint and his kind of flagrantly punchable face. The whole Parliament issue, the demise of the left and how it's become technocratic and Ed Miliband. Or I could have talked about all of that. And I thought, well, Wyn will probably do something like that, and he will do it much better than I will. So there's these kind of kids with singing. I kind of got into the mood, what would it be like if I was a benevolent dictator for a day, right? Just take 5, because New Labour in 1997, when they were elected, I don't know if you remember, probably don't, but they had a very effective campaign thing. They had a pledge card, which was just 5 things. If we get elected, we're going to do this. And it worked really well as a kind of communication device, with just 5 things, and they weren't anything special. It was like, one was reduce class sizes to 30 or something like this. Really kind of modest, doable things. So I thought I'm going to take my 5 things, my modest proposal for making Britain a healthier, prosperous and frankly better looking place. So, my 5 proposals for a benevolent dictator for a day. Right, the monarchy. We've got to get rid of the monarchy in this country, right? You can't be a serious, grown-up country and at the same time have a system that celebrates and venerates the idea, just the very suggestion of it, that you could be in a position of authority and power just because the institution of you're born into it is just so decisively wrong as to be, frankly, just defies any reasonable explanation, right? Of course, the typical arguments in favour of the monarchy are, well, they bring in money, right? A lot of tourists like it, they bring in money, they provide political stability, and then there's always the argument which is, well, what would you want to have Nick Clegg or Tony Blair as head of state? Would you rather have Madge, right, or Tony Blair? And, well, the obvious arguments to this, counter-arguments, of course, is, well, as if tourists aren't going to come to London just because you don't have to get to see the Queen anyway, right? And they still go to palaces in France and Germany and these kinds of places. So it's the money thing's neither here nor there, right? And of course the Nick Clegg Blair argument is easily answered. Well, of course you'd rather have Nick Clegg or Tony Blair because you could kick them out. And of course you can't kick the Queen out. So the argument becomes nearly inverted. And I just think if it's about ownership of the country and how you feel about the country, and these kinds of things are celebrating hierarchy and status and, you know, kind of stupid fawning over royal babies, at what point, right, if we didn't have a monarchy, at what point would you think it would be a good idea to invent one? Now, maybe in the kind of 11th century, I can see the point, right? But in the 21st century, we're trying to be a grown-up society, taking responsibility for ourselves, and, you know, hopefully having a more inclusive, participatory, multicultural democracy. Monarchy simply has no place in it whatsoever. And while you're at it, take that dirge of a national anthem with you. Thank you very much. So, number one, monarchy has to go. Secondly, we need to have a free and open internet. Right, these, by the way, are not necessarily my top 5 proposals. These won't even necessarily be my top 5 proposals tomorrow. These were just the 5 that occurred to me at the time. A free and open internet, and not just as in Obama in internet regulation in the United States, right, with multi-speed. What I'm thinking of here is GCHQ and the NSA and Ed Snowden and all the nefarious spying that now goes on over the internet. Because, you know, I'm not that old, right? But I can remember an era before the internet existed. And, you know, you probably can't, okay? You've all grown up with the internet, no doubt you take it for granted, okay? But I can remember the sheer kind of just mesmerising joy of typing in a web page, and literally within 20 minutes that web page would download, and it would take a long time, but you could do it, and it was amazing, right? And on a daily basis I get completely amazed by the internet still. It's genuinely one of the wonders of the world, one of the greatest things that the human race has ever come up with. And then you've got the security agencies who want to ruin it by spying on everybody. And as we know from the NSA revelations, they're just going around hoovering up information on a completely ad hoc, general basis, and then claiming that they're doing our security. Right? This is the kind of facile argument: if you've nothing to hide, you've nothing to fear. And it's all about terrorism. Well, we know that the NSA was spying on Angela Merkel, right? And we know that they were spying on various charities and you know, NGOs, as if these are terrorist organisations. It's not about terrorism at all, right? So I think that's a sort of really nefarious thing. But it's also problematic because it doesn't even work, right? Spying on people, on terrorists over the internet is completely ineffective. And it's ineffective because it's so trivially easy to get round. All you need is a VPN connection, right? A virtual private network. Now, this is not completely fail-safe, and these things are crackable, but it takes a hell of a long time to do it, right? The strongest methods of encryption you have, you can get access to a VPN. Well, I use one, and I'm not a member of the Tinfoil Brigade, but all my internet stuff goes through a VPN, and I pay about £15 a quarter, and all my stuff's completely encrypted. Which is great for getting TV shows that you don't want to pay for, as well as other, you know, genuine things. And so, but all you need to circumvent this stuff is a VPN connection. So the only thing that the NSA and GCHQ are doing by spying on people is you're not going to catch any decent terrorists, right, with kind of half a brain. You're going to get the duffers, right, who've done what they're doing, and you're going to get everybody else, right? And all this is going to do is drive more and more people to take up VPNs and take up methods of encryption. It's going to make following genuine terrorism a lot harder to crack, right? So, spying on people over the internet is just ineffective, and it doesn't work. And the whole thing, and it amazes me, because I used to do a module on this kind of thing, right? War on terror. And I would ask students, when I got to this part of the module about this, and I would raise this with students, whether or not they thought it was a good idea, and 90% of them just couldn't care less, which is completely apathetic, like, well, Google knows, you know, where I am, so I don't care if the NSA knows what I'm doing, I've got nothing to hide, I've got nothing to fear, right? Wrong. You've got everything to fear from an overweening state in these kinds of things. And there are cases where people have suffered because of this. There are academic researchers, for example, who are researching terrorism, and they've downloaded documents Al-Qaeda training manuals, right? It's part of their genuine research, okay? And they've gone, they've spent, weeks in jail because of this. There was a case in the United States where this was after the Boston bombing, the marathon thing, right? The pressure cooker bomb. And this woman was researching on the internet. She wanted to buy a new pressure cooker, right? I mean, you already see exactly where this is going to go. Because she was a vegan, she liked eating quinoa, which is kind of a couscous rice thing, I think. I don't know what it is. And her son was doing research on the Boston bombing, and all this stuff was going over the internet. Anyway, she got a visit from the men in black coats, wanting to know why she was doing all this research, and she told them she was a vegan, she wanted to know the best way to cook quinoa. They refused to believe that quinoa even existed and thought she was making the whole thing up, and held her in her home and questioned her for several hours. These are the kinds of things that genuinely can happen, right? So it doesn't work, it's not effective, and it's detrimental to everybody else. You can't trust these people, folks. These are the same people, the security agencies, that have been proven to be involved, complicit in the torture and extraordinary rendition of terrorist suspects, right? There's no kind of doubt over this. This has actually happened, and these are the people that are spying on you right now. And the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, imagine what we would have said if the Stasi, secret police in Germany, had this capability. Beyond their wildest dreams, now it's routine. So that was point number 2. Point number 3, my moderate proposal, is for radical economic reforms, maybe not so moderate after all. Wyn's talked fairly extensively and in detail about some of the more sensible things, perhaps, about the need to raise levels of productivity and all that. I completely accept all of that, but one of the things that kind of just really annoys me in all of this, and this is not coming from Wyn, by the way, I'm making anything there, is this myth that we have consistently in our discourse in British politics about the efficiency of the private sector and the innate inefficiency of the public sector. It seems to be the default position since 1979. The private sector is good, the public sector is bloated and inefficient and bad. And I'm not, by the way, saying it's the other way around, and the public sector is fantastic and the private sector is not efficient and so on, but it's just out of balance, right? It wasn't the public sector that crashed the economy in 2008. Regardless of what we're being told about levels of welfare spending and all the rest of it. Levels of public debt in the UK were within European averages prior to the 2008 crash. It was the private sector, it was the greed and corruption of the private sector that crashed and melted down the economy, for which everyone else is paying. So a few things we could do here then, right? I think we should have a greater role for the state. And I'm not a massive sort of socialist thinking we should have state control of everything, but renationalise the railways would be a start. I mean, that's been a complete, unremitting disaster since John Major privatised them. It would be publicly popular, I imagine, to renationalise them. While we're at it, we could renationalise the utility companies, the energy companies, things that everyone else relies on, basic needs in this country. The economy needs energy, the economy needs water. These are not things, I think, slightly immoral, these are public goods that people profit from. We've got an acute housing crisis in this country. The sort of first Labour government after the Second World War made it a massive priority to have a huge house building project. Why can't? It's not beyond the remit of people to have something like that. We could also scrap, these are kind of populist things, I guess. It doesn't mean they're wrong. We could scrap Trident, we could use the money to have free higher education tuition fees rather than this obnoxious £9,000 a year. And we could also impose greater regulations on the City of London. We could even nationalise the banks. Let's face it, we paid for them in the first place, right? But the myth we have here with city bonuses is that, well, they'll go elsewhere. There's a global pool for talent. If we don't pay these people these bonuses and these wages, they'll go to other places, right? I think it's a complete myth, right? The only place in the world that pays higher levels of bonuses and wages to people in the financial sector is the United States. And they can't all go to the United States because there's only so many jobs to go round, right? Britain is second in the league tables, unless they're going to start going to France or Belgium or Germany or Italy, right? Probably they like it in London anyway, so I don't buy this idea that people will simply leave. Secondly, is this idea that they're being rewarded for their performance with these bonuses. Because studies into institutional organisations and performance and how people are motivated, right, demonstrate that financial incentives only work for increasing performances for labour-intensive jobs. These are things like piecework in factories, right? You're getting paid by how much stuff you churn out. For things like intellectual work and financial services and that kind of thing, the same mentality doesn't apply. So it doesn't serve to have this kind of productivity argument built in. And finally on this point, studies have also demonstrated that these kind of high flyers in the city, very often their success is not due to their particular individual talents, but due to the institution that they happen to be working for and the particular circumstances of the time. And there are studies into this that have found that when these people, these big high flyers, these rising stars, leave these institutions and get jobs elsewhere, they don't perform anywhere half as nearly as well as they did. So we can start by doing all of that. My modest proposals for political reform are these. I think one of the problems, the big problems we have in Britain, is Westminster. Westminster is a huge blot on the political landscape, right? And we have this kind of idea in British politics that British politics is broken. And we see this with the expenses scandal, loss of trust in MPs, and you hear MPs all the time say we need to rebuild trust in British politics. If you look at levels of trust in British politics, it's been completely nowhere since the 1950s, right? Does anybody suggest we really need to go back, 60 years to rebuild trust? I mean, come on. I mean, nobody trusts politicians, and they haven't for a long time. But the problem, I think, is this. It's not that British politics is broken. The system isn't broken. The system, and I don't want to sound like Russell Brand in this particular point, but the system is supposed to work like this. This is the system doing what it's supposed to do. It's not supposed to let you in. It's not supposed to share power. The system is there in Westminster to keep power for itself and to lock people out of it. So some modest proposals for getting rid of this, right? First of all, we can have full PR. A full PR would create a whole bunch of problems, I admit, not least Nick Clegg would just never go away, UKIP would have a greater representation, things you don't like would undoubtedly happen, but PR would be great for getting rid of the two-party system and for giving people a proper say in politics. Because when it comes to the general election, I forget what the exact figure is now, but it's something like 15 to 20% of seats in the general election are going to decide it. Like most seats are predictable, safe seats, they don't care what happens in those seats. It's going to be either Labour or Conservative, and you can predict it, from the get-go. There's a very, very small number of swing seats that are going to decide the election, and that can't be good for democracy, it can't be good for political engagement, so we should have full PR. We can also have a fully elected House of Lords. I quite like, I'm not one of these, the House of Lords is good, I think, in a way. Ironically, it's been one of the defenders of human rights and British democracy in this kind of era of the war on terror, right? And one of the few things to stand up to the government. And I quite like the idea of having an organisation of experts. I like the idea we have an elected chamber which has people like Robert Winston in it, for example, right? He's a sort of geneticist and scientist guy. So I think we can have a fully elected chamber of experts, not politicians. I don't know how it would work and how you pick this list of experts, but I think it'd be a great thing and would infuse our policy making in the initial chamber. We can also ban political parties. Okay, you can't really ban political parties, it's going to be too problematic, but one of the things you could do is you could take away the power of the whips in the House of Commons, and one of the ways you could do that is by having secret voting for MPs. So at the moment, MPs have got to go out of the chamber, and they've got to walk through the lobby, and they get counted going through the doors. That's arcane, it's unnecessary, they can sit there and press a button on their smartphone or whatever it is, and they can cast their votes. And if you made it secret, the whips would have no power over their MPs because MPs could vote whichever way they wanted. Now, clearly that's not great for democracy. You've got to be able to know which way your elected representatives voted. You could release all the information at the end of the parliamentary cycle and see if they were telling the truth or lying. That would be one way around it, right? But the power of the whips and the power of the parties is a stultifying presence in British politics and needs to go. And finally, just on this point, more frequent elections. I hate elections, but the idea that, and now of course we have a parliament that stands for 5 years, right, and can't be dissolved. We've got fixed elections. Okay, there's an argument to be said for that, but really 5 years, I mean, choosing the maximum period that you're going to be allowed is not, really kind of and a great thing for democracy. Maybe 3 years would be more appropriate. So more elections to Parliament, so we can throw them out more often, would be great. And perhaps also on this point, direct internet voting. More referenda. The Scottish referendum was great, right? It was really got people enthusiastic. We'd have more of that kind of thing, and we could utilise the internet to do it. That's my modest proposal number 4. Finally, modest proposal number 5. A fully secular state, I think, would be nice on this point. And I was motivated by this because I kind of sway between being kind of lukewarm and ambivalent and being strongly militant on it. And in this choir competition last night, they had kids, these kids were standing there singing songs about Jesus. They're 7 years old. They're singing, Jesus is my rock and he doesn't let me roll, or whatever it is. Oh, you know, my God is a big God. And I think, you're 7 years old, you've got no idea what you're talking about. You haven't thought about all of this stuff, right? You're being made to stand there and something was weird and creepy and just morally wrong, really. Obviously, you don't have a problem with people picking whatever religious viewpoints they like. It's human rights, and it's fine. But don't sort of try to instill it in children, right? I think that's kind of crossing the line when you're trying to influence them and, you know, let them grow up for themselves and decide whichever point of view. When I have conversations with my 7-year-old about this, well, I don't actually, you know, but when he kind of tries to butt into conversations about it, I don't let him. Because I have a rule that he's not old enough to take part in these conversations, and he can't have an opinion. He's banned from having an opinion on religious issues until he's about 13 or something like that. That's my general household rules. We have a fully secular state. The final thing here, which means no bishops in the House of Lords, means no prayers in Parliament, and it also means no faith schools. We should get rid of all faith schools in this country, right? It's at the moment, the faith schools count for about, religious schools, around about a third of all secondary schools, it's around about 20% of all primary schools. The argument you get for faith schools, the strongest argument you get, is that they get better grades, right, than secular schools. And it's true, generally, it depends how you measure it, but generally speaking, they do get better grades at GCSE level and A level, right? The reason they get better grades is also because they discriminate against people from poorer backgrounds. Faith schools, schools of a religious character, statistically have significantly less proportion of students from poor backgrounds, and they measure this in terms of the number of students in receipt of free school meals, right? They have significantly fewer numbers of students from these backgrounds. They discriminate against them. They take the students out from the more middle class backgrounds, and they have more educational resources at home. That's why they get better results. It's unacceptable. And by the way, this is not a kind of militantly anti-religious point. There is an organisation, I forget the name off the top of my head, to get rid of faith schools and to have free and fair open school admissions, and it's headed by a rabbi. Okay, there are a lot of religious people, by the way, who don't like faith schools because they see it as the church having abandoned its commitment to speak up for the marginalised and the poor and the dispossessed because they're discriminating against them in this way. So my final proposal would be to have a fully secular state. So, in sum, my 5 things: scrap the monarchy, have a free and open internet, radical economic reform, radical political reform, and a fully secular state. And thank you very much for listening to my modest proposal.
All right, any questions? Right.
Who's the...
Yeah.
To you, sir.
To me?
The first point, yes.
Okay, yeah.
The first point about getting rid of the monarchy.
Yeah.
What is the impediment that we currently face having a monarch, and not simply on the principle, but on the practical issue?
Yeah, you can't separate the two. One of the arguments in favour of the monarchy is, well, it's just a symbol, right? And they don't cost very much money. I mean, you could use the money for other things, of course you could, right? But in the grand scheme of things, they're not like comparable to nuclear weapons, right? Or defence spending or welfare spending. It's a very, very tiny amount. So that would be one of the arguments again for keeping the monarchy, right? It don't cost very much. It's just symbolic, and it's all fluff, and Parliament opens, and it's all this kind of royal paraphernalia, and it's not really very important, right? But that argument is just completely, like, politics is about symbols. right? Politics is completely symbolic. I mean, that's why we have flags, for goodness sake, right? And things like this. Politics is completely about symbols. And so when you, to suggest that you can separate out the two and say, well, the practical thing is not so much the principal thing, let's leave that to one side. You can't leave that to one side. The principal thing on this is extremely important, right? And so everything that they stand for seems to me to be completely antithetical to what, if you were to write down a list of what a proper democratic, society would look like, a monarchy would just have no part to play in that whatsoever, with the hereditary principle, which is just completely bizarre that we should have this. And as I say, if we didn't already have one, we would not invent it. We wouldn't wake up one day and go, it would be a really good idea, but let's give lots of money and, ultimately power, let's forget, let's not forget as well, in this case, to some mediocre talentless family, would be my response.
Anyone else?
Hello.
Mr. Kettell, you mentioned possibility of internet voting.
Yeah.
So how could that be possible if there's less state regulation of the internet and security? Wouldn't that be of a lot of deviations and acts?
Over to what? Over to abuse, you mean?
Abuse, yes.
Yeah, possibly it would. My starting principle is, would it be beyond the wit of man, or obviously women too, right? The wit of humanity to devise a system whereby you could have internet voting without, large-scale fraud. It's not as if you don't get fraud at the moment, right? And there's always cases of postal fraud. Okay, it happens at every single general election. I don't know if you've ever done this. If you get the chance, by the way, and you haven't done it, you should go and do it. Go and be a returning officer, whatever it is. People who work in the polling booths on election day, because it's a real experience, right? And you just sort of see it from the other side and you find lots of. It's easy to commit fraud. Okay, you don't have to provide any evidence who you are when you go into a polling station, right? You can just go to a polling station. You don't even have to, by the way, legally, I think if I remember rightly, give them your polling card, right? You just give them a name. They have to let you vote. Then if somebody else comes along and you've stolen their vote, they won't go through the thing and find your vote. They'll just say, we'll just leave it as it is. And at the end of the day, if it comes down to one vote, then we'll go and dig out what it is, right? So it's very, very easy to commit fraud on that scale. And so, yeah, clearly, you're going to have fraud. But, we have internet banking, right? There are ways around this of securitising the thing. So I don't think it would be beyond the ability of people to find a way to do it. And it would also be great for, invigorating democracy. Why hold general elections on a Thursday, right, for one day? Why not say, you've got the weekend, everybody's got their card, you can vote online. We're used to it with the X Factor and Strictly Come Dancing. We do it all the time. So it's just time to kind of, get with it.
So, just to sort of kind of draw your two halves together, so I was wondering when Wyn talked about sort of the lack of change post the financial crisis and the lack of sort of radical shift in how we approach politics. Is it a case that you think this is something that is sort of fixed, or you think it's the calm before the storm, as it were? Do you think that possibility still exists, or that the crisis that opened up possibility is now closed again? So anything you could see, the proposals that you talked about, any space in which we could move towards something like that? What new policy levers are available to us post sort of financial crash?
Because the main beneficiaries of the crash in political terms have been the populist right. They are the people who gained ground and gained leverage as a consequence of the crash. Because if there was another crash, then this might, again, which is always possible, might stimulate something. There clearly were some kinds of reactions to the crash, which involved some sort of new thinking, such as the Occupy movement, but it was pretty incoherent actually. It wasn't quite clear, it was clear, I think, for some of those people what they were against. It wasn't quite clear what they were for in terms of actual proposals for change. And I think certainly the impetus for change at the international level in terms of trying to have more effective regulation of the financial system was something that existed in the immediate aftermath of the crash, when there was a real sense that the financial system could collapse, so there was some impetus to do things, but that impetus has then since then been lost, because there's always room, there's always space for new ideas to come forward. The question is whether in fact those new ideas come together in some kind of coherent paradigm, in the way that Keynesianism offered a coherent paradigm, or indeed that neoliberalism offered a coherent paradigm. That hasn't happened, I think, in this particular crisis.
Anyone else?
I think my question was, I guess, mostly for Wyn, I guess both of you could answer it. I think it's like the case that we often we call on our elected governments and ask for them to deal with a lot of issues that you highlighted. But I was kind of interested in what you thought kind of the role of, like, for example, the Bank of England has in addressing some of these issues, and whether they actually have the policy levers to do so.
Yeah, well, it was the Bank of England, back in 1997, of course, had its role expanded in terms of, in relation to monetary policy, interest rate policy. I think what happened then, and it wasn't just a failure of the Bank of England, it was also a failure of tripartite machinery that was supposed to exist between the Bank, the Treasury, and what was then the Financial Standards Authority, was that people took their eye off the ball in terms of issues of financial stability of the financial system. There was a neglect of those issues, a failure perhaps to pay attention to some of the signs of increasing stress in the financial system, which is why the crash overtook people so quickly, and for many people was a great surprise. Now, of course, since then, there's been a greater emphasis on these financial stability issues, and new mechanisms have been set up within the Bank of England to try and deal with financial stability issues. It's probably a bit too early to say how effectively those are working, but in many ways I think, although obviously domestic regulation is not unimportant, where there is real need for agreement is at the international level, because when you're dealing with an international financial system, which has no respect for national boundaries. And there, I think, there has been some progress. I wouldn't say nothing has happened. But I think the progress has been insufficient in relation to the scale of the problems that we face in trying to ensure that this international financial system doesn't run into similar kinds of problems again. So that's where the real dilemma is. And I'm less confident than Government Banks talk about this, is that I'm less confident than he is about what has actually been achieved.
So do you think that the kind of the remit that the Bank of England currently has in terms of mainly focusing on financial stability is sufficient, or should its role be wider? Should it be looking at the fact that we have a productivity problem? Should it be looking at the fact that wages are rising and other issues that
Well,
you mentioned?
yeah, obviously in some ways the focus of the bank is quite a narrow focus. Although the bank makes a lot of the fact that it has these regional agents who seek to engage with firms in their regions and so on, it is a relatively narrow focus. The problem is, of course, is how much authority you want to surrender to what essentially is an institution that's beyond democratic control. The democratic accountability, the governor of the bank has to appear before the Treasury Committee in the House of Commons. There is some discussion of appointments, new appointments to the Monetary Policy Committee and so on are subject to scrutiny. But these are fairly limited controls. This is essentially, as indeed is the case for most central banks in most countries, an institution which is beyond very much in the way of democratic accountability. And that does raise questions about democracy if you give even greater scope to the bank. But it probably is the case that the bank does need to take more account of some of these macroeconomic factors than it does at the present time. It needs to have perhaps a a broader consideration of those issues.
Do we have any more questions? Alright, thank you so much. That was really interesting.